1 minute ago, no one believed Dwayne Johnson until he exposed Diddy's evidence in court. 1 minute ago, no one expected Dwayne Johnson to say this in court about Diddy. For weeks, the Diddy trial has unraveled claims of manipulation, silence, and systemized abuse within the entertainment industry. But nothing could have prepared the courtroom for the arrival of global icon Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. His unannounced appearance did more than shift the narrative, it detonated it. When the side door opened and Dwayne entered, there was no red carpet, no spotlight. Only the stark silence of a courtroom on edge. No cameras, no handlers, and most telling of all, no press release. It was not the man Hollywood knew, but the man it never wanted to. Content warning. The following contains descriptions of psychological abuse, disturbing rituals, and allegations of coercive control. Viewer discretion is advised. I don't want to be here, but I have to be. I've lived with something that's eaten away at me for almost 20 years. And the truth is, I'm still scared. But I'm more scared of what happens if I stay silent. Then came the oath, and the dam broke. Johnson began his testimony by recalling the earliest moments of his Hollywood career. 2001, fresh off the success of The Scorpion King. Hungry, ambitious, and by his own admission, naive. Enter Sean "Diddy" Combs, a gatekeeper with the power to open doors and close futures. At first it seemed like mentorship. Industry nights, champagne handshakes, Johnson said. But soon the gatherings shifted from networking to vetting. It stopped being about talent. It became about obedience. Diddy allegedly invited Johnson to a series of private events. No cameras, no contracts, no publicists. Just veiled instructions. Then came the first real test. I was asked to meet him at an undisclosed location outside LA. The driver didn't speak, just turned up the music. When I got there, I was blindfolded, escorted into a room draped in black cloth, candles, red light, and silence. Johnson detailed an initiation ritual involving raw monkey brains served on steel trays. 5 men in suits watched in silence. At the head of the table, Diddy, calm and composed, he said, "Everyone who's made it ate, everyone who didn't vanished." Then he looked at me and said, "Hollywood isn't about talent, it's about obedience." Dwayne paused, his voice cracked. That was the moment I broke. With a spoon trembling in his hand, he complied. I don't remember the taste. I remember the silence after. According to Johnson, this wasn't hazing. It was the start of psychological conditioning. He spoke of being placed in soundproof rooms, denied phones, fed unpredictably, and subjected to repetition-based reprogramming. Affirmations about surrender, scripts designed to test loyalty. They made us confuse fear with progress, he said. Pain with purpose. One retreat in the desert stood out, no agents, no execs, just entertainers. Some big names, some just starting out. All of us are uncomfortable. He described seeing a younger actor crying in a hallway. He said to me, "They told me this is what it takes." That night, Dwayne left early. It would be years before he understood what he'd witnessed, an industrialized system built on fear, rewards, and silence. It wasn't mentorship, it was machinery. He looked at the judge, the jury, and finally the gallery again. People wonder why we don't speak out. It's not because we agree, it's because we know what happens when we don't comply. As the first day of his testimony concluded, no one moved. Even the defense remained motionless. Because for the first time in this trial, someone didn't just describe Diddy's power. They exposed the structure that kept it intact. Inside the hushed walls of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse, the silence that followed Dwayne. The Rock Johnson's initial testimony was more deafening than any gavel. It wasn't just the weight of his confession. It was the sense that something fundamental had shifted. And as he continued to speak, what began as a personal reckoning transformed into a seismic indictment of the very architecture of fame. I wasn't special. I was obedient, Dwayne said quietly, looking not at the judge nor at Diddy, but out at the gallery, perhaps addressing every young actor, watching from the shadows of doubt. He described in painful detail what came after the now infamous initiation involving the consumption of raw monkey brains. A grotesque metaphor turned into a literal test of silence. Dwayne told the court that was the entry fee, not into success, into silence. From that point forward, everything changed. The phone calls, the offers, the connections. He began to receive roles and endorsements that just weeks prior had been impossible to secure. I thought I'd arrived, he admitted, but I was assigned. His words pierced the courtroom. As he recounted it, his rise was no longer a celebration of merit, but an orchestrated path laid out by invisible hands. Hollywood, he said, didn't reward talent alone, it rewarded submission. Johnson described another gathering. What was presented as a business retreat in the desert turned out to be something altogether more disturbing. We were isolated, he said. No windows, phones confiscated, loud music pumped into the walls 24/7. Meals were irregular. You didn't know when they'd come or if they'd come. It sounded more like psychological warfare than networking. He paused. At the time, I convinced myself this was elite training, mind-body mastery. But it wasn't. His voice lowered again. It was conditioning, designed to erase who you were so they could build who they needed. When asked by the prosecution to describe who they were, Dwayne looked to the jury, the machine, the handlers, the money behind the scenes. It's never just one man. Diddy was the gatekeeper. But the gate was built long before him. Johnson shared that following what he termed the obedience trials, his career skyrocketed in ways that felt artificial. Scripts I hadn't auditioned for started showing up, offers that bypassed normal protocol. My agent said, "You're hot right now." But no one could tell me why. Then came the strings. Every opportunity had a shadow, a warning. You're being watched. Play nice. He recounted one conversation with a major studio executive. They said, "We hear you're someone who understands how the system works." That was code. I nodded. Because what else could I do? His legal team entered into evidence a series of text exchanges between Johnson and unnamed studio figures, highlighting how projects were contingent on staying in alignment with the structure. It was language so vague yet so charged that its meaning felt undeniable. At this point, Dwayne spoke directly to the unspoken fear that had governed his silence. He described how being disinvited from one party led to an entire role being pulled without explanation. You learn quickly, he said, that absence has a price. Even his team, the agents, the managers, the publicists, played their roles. They never told me what not to say. They didn't need to. They'd flinch when I said the wrong name. That was enough. The courtroom sat paralyzed as Dwayne Johnson unveiled the cold mechanics of social control within elite circles. It's not a conspiracy. It's culture. You don't need rules when everyone knows what the punishment is. Dwayne then turned to the moment when his silence began to unravel. It was supposed to be a private screening. A few friends, some executives. Instead, it was something else. He described walking into a mansion cloaked in theatrical secrecy. Masks weren't for fun. They were for anonymity, phones locked away, names whispered. Then came the image that will likely haunt this case, a young, well-known actor, unnamed by the court, sobbing quietly in a hallway, repeating the words, "They told me this is what it takes." That was the crack in the mask, Dwayne said. The moment I realized this wasn't just about me. It was a machine built to feed itself. For all the physical grotesqueries and psychological manipulation, Johnson's testimony made clear the most terrifying mechanism of all plausible deniability. There's no document, no witness, just silence. Silence and opportunity. He told the jury how the system didn't need to coerce. It just had to convince you that you had no choice. I was praised when I was compliant, ignored when I asked questions, and slowly I stopped asking. In a dramatic reversal, Johnson recounted the moment he decided to reclaim his story. I was filming overseas. I got a message from someone close to Cassie Ventura. They said, "She's going to testify. She's doing it." That was the trigger. I realized that if she could risk it all, so could I. At this point, Johnson turned to the gallery voice, trembling but firm. "I don't want to be a symbol. I don't want pity. I want accountability." He gestured toward Diddy, who remained silent, jaw clenched. "And I want the man who taught me fear to see that it didn't last." As Dwayne Johnson stepped down from the stand, the courtroom didn't applaud. But the atmosphere shifted from disbelief to resolve. Legal experts whispered about obstruction. Investigative journalists began racing to connect dots. And online, the phrase "obedience trials" trended across every major platform. Because this wasn't just about Diddy anymore. It was about the cost of silence and the growing rebellion against it. As court resumed the following morning, the energy in the room was no longer speculative. It was charged with momentum. The courtroom, once a crucible of silence and stifled truths, was now the stage for what legal analysts are calling a reckoning decades overdue. And at the center of it all, Dwayne Johnson, no longer just a witness, but a whistleblower. Johnson sat straighter than the day before, no longer trembling, no longer hesitant. A man who had survived the system and now intended to expose it fully. If yesterday had been a confession, today was a strategy. He began with a line that would echo across airwaves and headlines by nightfall. The abuse wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was a yes that cost you more than any no. Dwayne described the weeks following his desert retreat, an experience he now understood not as an outlier, but a deliberate test of psychological loyalty. The conditioning didn't stop when he left the estate. They didn't just want your agreement. They wanted your transformation. He revealed that shortly after that event, subtle shifts began happening in his environment. He noticed new assistants, new handlers, people he had never hired. They didn't ask questions, they just appeared. They weren't there to help. They were there to observe. One such assistant, according to Johnson, turned out to be tied to a production company under one of Diddy's affiliate networks, someone who had access to all of Johnson's calendar's dressing rooms and on-set routines. "I realized I had a shadow," he said grimly. The prosecution submitted time-stamped metadata from Johnson's own security system logs, showing a repeated unidentified access signature tied to a staff member placed by a third-party concierge service. It happened during the exact filming period of 2 major action films. Johnson had never requested the service. Johnson then brought forward what he called the Velvet Clause, mirroring testimony previously introduced by Paris Jackson in her father's name. I didn't know that term back then, but now I see it everywhere. He revealed an early development agreement never executed that had an unusual rider, a behavioral section labeled Influence Continuity. Legal analysts reviewing it later noted chilling language that referenced emotional modulation, resonance alignment, and presentation conformity during public appearances. "It wasn't about how I acted on screen," Dwayne said. "It was about how I behaved when the cameras weren't rolling." He paused. It was like they were licensing not just my brand, but my reactions. The defense objected. The judge overruled, and the courtroom sat riveted. Then came perhaps the most personal segment of the testimony. Dwayne described a former colleague, an emerging actor he met during the early 2000s, someone he described as bright, funny, raw talent. "We were both rising at the same time," he said. "But I noticed he was being pulled into the deeper rooms earlier than I was." They shared an unspoken connection, brief glances, quiet warnings, but never voiced what they suspected. Then one day that colleague vanished from public view. No accident, no scandal, just gone. Dwayne said he attempted to contact him through shared managers. No replies. Industry friends shrugged. "Bad deal," they said. "He crossed someone." But years later, while preparing for a Netflix project, Dwayne said he found a single unread message in an old email folder from that actor sent 5 years earlier. It read, "If they ask you to stay past midnight, say no. If they hand you a mask, don't put it on. If they offer you legacy, ask who writes it. Dwayne submitted it as evidence. The courtroom was silent again. Johnson detailed what he now believed to be a pattern of ritualized social control, not just through humiliation, but through selective elevation. You think you're being rewarded for merit, he explained, but what you're really being tested for is obedience. He recounted private dinners with A-list producers, where no one used names, only titles, where contracts were discussed but not signed, where silence was praised more than talent. They called it discretion, Dwayne said. I call it rehearsed complicity. He emphasized the power of language, how euphemisms like circle tier and protocol replaced darker realities, coercion, isolation, psychological breakdown. At one gathering, he was told he'd be introduced to level 4. When he asked what that meant, the reply chilled him. Level 4 isn't what you get, it's what you lose. It was not lost on the courtroom that Johnson's testimony, despite its power, came only after others had first stepped forward. In particular, he credited singer Cassie Ventura's civil filing against Diddy as the moment the illusion cracked. She didn't just name him, he said, she named the rules. Dwayne revealed that after reading Ventura's statements, he broke down, because I recognized myself in what she described. The pressure, the grooming, the erasure. Her courage, he said, gave his own silence a deadline. That's the thing about secrets. You think they die with time, but they don't. They wait for someone braver than you to speak first. As Johnson's testimony continued, reactions began pouring in. Online forums trended with hashtags like $Star Velvet Clause, Years Level 4, and Obedience Currency. Multiple former industry insiders reached out anonymously to reporters, validating elements of Johnson's claims, especially around talent reorientation sessions at private estates. One studio assistant anonymously confirmed the existence of Level Room's soundproof suites used for actor development in the hills of Laurel Canyon. They weren't sound stages, the source claimed. They were silence chambers. Federal investigators have since subpoenaed architectural blueprints for 3 such properties linked to Diddy's production affiliates. You don't get to define my legacy. Dwayne closed the third session with a final emotional pivot, not just back toward Diddy, but to the industry at large. You told me I needed to play along to survive, he said, staring across the courtroom. But survival isn't success if it costs your voice. He continued, you taught me how to obey, but I had to teach myself how to remember. As the court recessed for the day, murmurs filled the hall. For the first time, legal analysts agreed this trial had crossed into new territory. No longer just about the alleged crimes of one man, but about the culture that enabled him, protected him, and replicated him across decades of silence. Tomorrow, the court will hear from another unnamed witness, one allegedly connected to multiple level rooms and reconditioning rituals. Prosecutors believe this testimony may confirm Dwayne Johnson's claims and introduce an even larger network of influence. Day 4 of testimony in the Sean Diddy Combs federal trial began not with a known face, but with a cloaked identity. The courtroom was hushed as the judge granted anonymity to the next witness, a former executive assistant and facility coordinator employed under several high-level entertainment subsidiaries connected to Bad Boy Entertainment. For safety reasons, the witness was identified only as Witness Delta. But what Witness Delta revealed was more than personal experience. It was a detailed roadmap into the very infrastructure of what is now being called Hollywood's compliance circuit. The courtroom lights were dimmed slightly to accommodate privacy protocols. As the voice distortion system was activated, the witness began with a chilling line. The rooms were never about talent. They were about to break it. According to Witness Delta, the so-called level rooms weren't a metaphor. They were physical locations constructed with precise architectural designs and psychological objectives. These weren't casual rehearsal spaces, the witness clarified. They were sound-controlled, visually manipulated, and monitored environments designed to disorient and recondition performers. Delta described 3 distinct locations. The Hills House, a secluded estate in Laurel Canyon, featuring mirrorless corridors and curved interior walls. Cameras embedded in sconces. No corners, no sharp angles, soundproofed. The Echo Suite, a subterranean chamber in Miami, with white noise, ventilation, artificial dusk lighting, and retractable walls. Used Delta claimed for loop exercises sessions where emerging talent repeated mantras of submission and self-erasure. The Glass Pavilion, a Malibu-facing cliffside studio, its walls entirely transparent, yet built with double-tinted glass to create constant reflections. There, performers were often kept in exposure mode, made to perform before two-way mirrors, while unknown observers watched from behind. The federal prosecution submitted corroborating documents, including internal project memos from 2013 marked Sensory Reintegration Suite usage logs. Several logs bore the initials SC, a now controversial acronym investigators say may reference system compliance or Sean Combs. We didn't call them tests, we called them evolutions. The witness confessed to having coordinated several of these sessions unaware at the time of their full implications. Talent was told they were receiving elite performance conditioning, Delta explained. But over time, I realized their identities were being dismantled, broken into obedience. The sessions followed strict psychological patterns: isolation, no clocks, no phones, no external stimuli. Mirror dialogue. Trainees were asked to speak to their own reflections while being evaluated by unseen observers. Light therapy. Exposure to pulsating LEDs intended to reset performance readiness. Reward withdrawal. Promises of opportunity that disappeared if commands weren't followed. When asked who authorized these programs, Delta paused. There was always a layer between the directive and the directive giver, they said. But every time something escalated, the name that came up was the same Diddy. The courtroom murmured. A defense objection was overruled. Prosecutors then revealed a dossier titled Phase 3 Conversion Targets, which listed several young entertainers, including aspiring actors, backup dancers, and vocalists, all of whom were allegedly placed into these rooms for programmatic exposure. The name Dwayne Johnson did not appear on the list. However, the file did include code names linked to stylists and music producers who have since vanished from public life. The gallery went quiet as Delta pointed to a name on the screen. Echo Unit 17, later confirmed as a stage name for an artist who died under suspicious circumstances in 2018. What happens when someone fails the program? A juror asked aloud. Delta hesitated. They disappear. Sometimes quietly, sometimes publicly, but always permanently. Midway through testimony, the prosecution introduced the Velvet Chain, an internal communication network used among talent managers, PR reps, and studio fixers. These encrypted threads allegedly serve to monitor the compliance behavior of high-profile clients. Screenshots of messages included lines such as, "He's wavering. Consider protocol reset. Get her to Malibu, mirror loop overdue. Silence asset pending after Q3 review." One particularly damning message referenced Dwayne Johnson by codename Stoneface, returning to the doubt cycle. Recommend Echo retraining before release. Johnson, seated behind the prosecution table, clenched his jaw as the quote was read. Witness Delta then described the moment they decided to walk away from the system. It was 2019. A young artist, barely 19, was brought into the Glass Pavilion. They told me to run the lighting board. No instruction, no supervision. Just start the loop and let the walls do the rest. They hesitated. She screamed. The courtroom froze. I wasn't allowed to intervene. I wasn't allowed to stop the music. I just stood there and watched her disappear into something I couldn't name. That night I deleted every file I could and walked out. In a final twist, Delta revealed they had attempted to leak a set of internal training videos to a journalist in 2021. However, the encrypted USB containing the data was intercepted in transit. 2 days later, my apartment was broken into, nothing stolen. Except for that drive. FBI cybercrime agents are now reopening the case using Delta's identification of the device's serial number to track its last known upload location, a remote server registered in Nassau, Bahamas. He didn't just build a label, he built a language. Delta closed with a statement that reverberated around the room. Sean Combs didn't just build a record label, he built a language of compliance. He created signals, rituals, conditions, a world where silence was currency and talent was simply the vessel. Diddy, now visibly pale, whispered to his attorney. Outside the courtroom, legal analysts say the cumulative testimony from Paris Jackson, Dwayne Johnson, and now witness Delta paints a picture not of isolated abuses but of systemic control. Tomorrow, a forensic tech specialist from a private contractor is expected to testify about recovered metadata and unreleased audio files from Diddy's archive studio sessions, some of which allegedly contain embedded compliance triggers and looped affirmations. The judge has warned both parties to prepare for the possibility of systemic implications, suggesting that this case may now extend beyond criminal court into congressional inquiry. As the nation watches, one thing is clear. This trial has moved beyond one man. It now sits at the intersection of power, silence, and a cultural reckoning long overdue. The morning of Day 5 opened not with a witness, but with a hard drive. Escorted by two federal marshals, FBI cyber forensics expert Agent Mallory Chen took the stand, holding a sealed evidence box. Inside the original blue phase drive, recovered from a dormant offshore server in the Bahamas, a server first flagged after the testimony of witness Delta. What Agent Chen revealed next would take the Diddy trial from the realm of conspiracy into forensic certainty. According to Agent Chen, the encrypted drive contained over 27 gigabytes of structured data, compliance logs, biometric reports, and most disturbingly, audio files labeled Echo Trials. Each entry was time-stamped, geotagged, and referenced by project code. One repeatedly stood out, VRLX17. That label, prosecutors argued, was a direct reference to the Velvet Relaxation Protocol, described by both Paris Jackson and witness Delta sessions, involving immersive light sound and emotional destabilization techniques. But the true breakthrough came from a 94-second file marked simply EchoJS04 AVI. When played in the courtroom, the video showed a dimly lit sound booth. A young male performer stood inside, repeating phrases with subtle variations. I give the sound permission. The light listens. I obey the light. The gift is theirs. The voice is not mine. No face was visible, but Agent Chen confirmed the booth structure matched the echo suite described in Part 4. The audio waveform was also embedded with ultrasonic loops, frequencies inaudible to the human ear, but detectable through spectral analysis. The climax of Agent Chen's testimony came with another file, direct voice command master.move. It was a raw studio session time-stamped January 2016. The voice was unmistakable Sean Diddy Combs, giving instructions to an unnamed producer. Bring her in slower this time, no intro. Just give her the light loop and wait until the breathing sinks. If she reacts, we lower the room. You don't train singers, you reshape the echo. You sell the illusion of freedom, not the song. For the first time, the jury heard Diddy refer to the system not as mythology, but as deliberate structure. The words weren't metaphoric, they were strategic. Under oath, Agent Chen declared, "We have conclusive metadata confirming that these files were created on systems registered to Blue Current Media Group, a now defunct production shell linked to 3 of Combs's known associates. These weren't fabricated. They're archived, indexed, and repeatedly referenced in the internal communications network we now know as the Velvet Chain." At that moment, Diddy's legal team requested a brief recess. The request was denied. Just when it seemed the revelations had peaked, prosecutors introduced one final exhibit, a PDF document extracted from the same drive marked Vault T1211, folder MJP override, final echo hand .doert. It was written in plain text, no headers. Just this sentence. If she finds the mirror, she will know how to break the light. A hushed silence fell over the room. Prosecutors confirmed the line mirrored an entry in Paris Jackson's previously sealed diary provided in Part 1. But here embedded in Diddy's own system files, it seemed to confirm that Michael Jackson's warnings were not only heard, but watched. Was Paris targeted? Has her withdrawal from the entertainment system been tracked? Investigators believe so, and if this file was part of Diddy's vault, it raises a far more haunting question. How long has the system known who would fight back? As the day ended outside the courthouse, an impromptu vigil began forming. Former backup dancers, choreographers, stylists, and mid-level producers, many of whom had remained silent for years, began speaking to the press. Their message was unified: we weren't crazy, we were cornered. And the system only listens when one of their own screams. Inside, prosecutors prepared for closing arguments. But the story now transcends verdicts, because this case is no longer about guilt alone. It is about legacy, about silence, and about whose voices get to echo back after the lights dim. 1 minute ago, the Honorable Judge Arun Subramanian has officially delivered the verdict in what is now known as the most culturally seismic trial of the decade. Courtroom 4B in the Southern District of New York had never felt colder. The hush was not from decorum, it was fear, reverence, finality. After 5 weeks of unrelenting testimony, digital revelations, and shocking confessions, the jury returned expressionless. 12 citizens, now transformed witnesses to history, had reached a unanimous decision. Judge Subramanian looked over his glasses and spoke without flourish. On all counts, this court finds Sean Diddy Combs guilty. Diddy was found guilty on 6 major federal counts, including conspiracy to commit human trafficking, psychological coercion via unlawful means, racketeering under the RICO Act, tampering with federal witnesses, use of subconscious manipulation technologies in entertainment, obstruction of justice in a federal investigation. Each charge came with damning evidence, not just testimony, but forensic confirmation from FBI cyber agents, whistleblowers, and most crucially, the previously encrypted Echo protocol drive. The sentence hearing is scheduled for 30 days from today, but legal analysts already estimate a sentence between 45 years to life. As the verdict rang out, Diddy did not blink. He sat upright, back straight. No slumped shoulders, no denial. But his eyes, once filled with defiance, had changed. There was no fear, only calculation. He turned slightly to his legal team, nodded once, then stood as marshals approached. His wrists were shackled without resistance. The only sound was the clicking of metal. No final words, no outbursts. The once untouchable mogul, the kingmaker of culture, was escorted out under the silent watch of the people whose voices he once manipulated. The streets outside were packed, not with paparazzi, but with people holding signs that read, "We believe Mia." Silence is over. No more kings without consequence. Paris Jackson was not present, but her representative issued a short, firm statement. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about truth, and now the silence belongs to us. In the days to come, investigators are expected to open sealed subpoenas, linked to more names across music, film, and elite business networks. The Department of Justice has already confirmed that at least 5 additional cases are now being prepared, with direct links to the Velvet Chain network exposed through this trial. Hollywood's inner circle, once seen as a fortress of immunity, is now under forensic audit. But beyond names and headlines, something deeper has shifted, an irreversible crack in the myth of power. Dwayne Johnson's testimony, Mia's tears, Paris's diary, they did not just win a case, they rewrote the rules of silence. And as Diddy vanished into the gray silence of federal custody, the echo of this trial remained behind, resonating through the culture he once ruled, now reshaped by those he underestimated most. because in the end, it wasn't the system that broke them, it was the truth that broke the system.